calls correctly a coup d'etat, corporate coup d'etat in slow motion, and it's over. They've won. We live in what the political philosopher Sheldon Wolin calls a system of inverted totalitarianism. And by that he means it's not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. That in classical totalitarian regimes, you have a reactionary or revolutionary party that replaces one structure with another. In inverted totalitarianism, you have corporate forces that purport to be loyal to the Constitution, electoral politics, the iconography and language of American patriotism, and yet internally have seized all of the levers of power to render the citizen impotent. And so that this political theater, which we are witnessing, is a charade. The Democrats are as beholden to corporate power as the Republicans. The judiciary has become a wholly owned subsidiary of the corporate state. And our only hope left is to build mass movements of dissent, and I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe, that can wrest power back from this rapacious corporate elite that quite literally will kill us. And I see, of course it's bleak. And you know, I'm sorry, the climate science reports are bleak. I'm not making it up. This kind of mania for hope is really a kind of sickness, because it prevents us from seeing how dire and catastrophic the situation is if we don't radically reconfigure our relationship to each other and to the ecosystem. And so, of course, people don't want to hear it. You know, they want to become entranced or mesmerized with the trivia that dominates the airwaves and the sagas and soap operas. And, you know, we are fed this mantra that is really fiction. And the mantra goes that we can have everything we want, that reality is never an impediment to what we desire, and that's given to us by Oprah, and it's given to us by Hollywood.
That's why
and the
we're
Christian
calling
right.
this show Reality Asserts Itself, because you can think that,
right?
But...
And it's a lie. It's not true. And I think we can't even use the word hope until we confront reality and begin to resist against the real. If we're resisting against a fantasy or fiction, if we believe that Barack Obama is going to save us, then, you know, it's like writing letters to Uncle Joe Stalin if he only knew what they were doing here out in, you know, the Ukrainian wheat fields, where, of course, millions of people died for the famine. Then everything we do is futile. So I think it's fundamental that we grasp reality in order to build effective resistance. And unfortunately, reality at this moment in human history is pretty bleak.
Well, let's pick that up in the next segment. So please join us, the next part of this series of interview with Chris Hedges on Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network. Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay in Baltimore, and welcome to our new show, Reality Asserts Itself. Now joining us in Baltimore is Chris Hedges. Thanks for joining us again.
Sure.
So, watch part 1 and part 2. You'll see the introduction down below is the full introduction of Chris. But by now everybody knows Chris is a great writer. He wrote for the New York Times for 15 years, and now he writes for Truthdig. So, how much of this lack of mass movement, although we need to say there is one, there are things happening all over the country and certainly all over the world. I mean, in some places, from Brazil to Egypt, surprising things are happening.
Right.
It's complicated, but things are happening. Right. On the other hand, we're not seeing this kind of even Brazilian-style mass movement here, and certainly not a wide-scale civil disobedience movement. But how much is that the responsibility, weakness, if you want, fault of the American left? In 2008, in a piece you wrote, Why Am I a Socialist? You wrote this: The inability to articulate a viable socialism has been our gravest mistake. Do you still believe that?
Yes, because we have allowed ourselves to embrace an ideology which at its core states that all governance is about maximizing corporate profit at the expense of the citizenry. For what do we have structures of government? For what do we have institutions of state, if not to hold up all the citizenry and especially the most vulnerable? You know, if you go back and look at the 1980s in especially the Scandinavian countries, they eradicated poverty virtually. I lived in Switzerland, I studied French in Switzerland, and there were no homeless. The mentally ill were taken care of. It has arguably one of the best healthcare systems in the world. My oldest son was born in Lausanne. And that was, it's actually a privatized system, but it's heavily regulated. Everybody pays into it, but everybody has health insurance. Senior public school teachers earned about as much as doctors. And with the wealth given to us as Americans, we could have eradicated poverty. We could have created a country that was much different than what we have created. And what's happening now is that we are being rapidly reconfigured into a kind of neo-feudal society, an oligarchic society where increasingly the bottom two-thirds of Americans are hanging on by their fingertips. You have a shrinking, diminishing middle class and an elite that is just making obscene amounts of money at our expense. And you can't sustain, first of all, you can't sustain a democracy and an oligarchy. That's not a new idea. Thucydides wrote about that, about ancient Athens. But secondly, because there are no self-imposed limits, and in this sense Karl Marx was right, that unfettered, unregulated capitalism, especially on a global scale, is a revolutionary force. They will push and push and push until there is a backlash. And I think part of what we're seeing with the security and surveillance state is a preparation for that backlash. The destruction of civil liberties, which has been brutal. The wholesale surveillance and monitoring of virtually every American citizen, which I think many of us suspected, and Edward Snowden, through his disclosures to Glenn Greenwald at The Guardian, made palpably real. The National Defense Authorization Act, and I sued the president in the Southern District Court of New York, and I won. Where now the Obama administration has appealed it, but this permits the military to seize, arrest American citizens, strip them of due process, and hold them in military detention centers, including our offshore penal colonies in places like Guantanamo or Bagram. And when Judge Catherine Forrest wrote her 112-page opinion, which I think is worth reading, she actually brings up the plight of the 110,000 Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II and stripped of due process, and said that this provision in the NDAA essentially allows the state to criminalize an entire group of people and lock them away without any legal redress. And they know what's coming. The NSA has run all sorts of scenarios on economic collapse and especially climate change, and they're preparing.
Let me add one thing to that. We did this in our coverage of the G20 protests in Toronto where 1,000 people were arrested.
Right.
But I think there's pretty clear evidence that when they arrest 1,000 people in Toronto, when there's very little happening, right, this is dress rehearsal. This is training for how do you do mass arrests.
And it's also a message to everyone else. I mean, let's remember that whatever the internal faults of the Occupy movement, and they were there, the Occupy movement was destroyed. And I was just at a trial in New York, Veterans for Peace, 25 people arrested. I was there in October 7th at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Plaza in New York, which technically closes at 10, but that's never enforced unless you're carrying out a public demonstration. That there is now a decision by the security and surveillance state to essentially seize all public space, to make any kind of protests within public space impossible, because they don't want to see generated another Occupy movement. And indeed, when many of these vets were arrested, the cops were telling them, look, we're vets, we don't want to arrest you, but the Occupy movement messed it up for you because we can't allow another one. The state was quite rattled by the Occupy movement and is determined not to allow a movement, a mass movement like that, to rise up again. And yet, you read Paul Krugman's columns in the New York Times, where he constantly calls for a rational response to the economic crisis. And a rational response would be moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, a forgiveness of student debt, a massive jobs program, rebuilding infrastructure, especially targeted at people under the age of 25. That would be rational. But the state doesn't respond rationally because there are no mechanisms, counter mechanisms now to make piecemeal or incremental reform possible, which was the role of the traditional liberal class, and I spend a long time in The Death of the Liberal Class laying this out. And so they keep pushing and pushing and pushing. You're seeing unemployment benefits being taken away. You're seeing Head Start programs being shut down. You're seeing an assault on public education. The Congress can't even cap the student debt at 3%. It's now risen to 6%, while at the same time the Fed is lending trillions of dollars to corporations like Goldman Sachs at virtually 0% interest. And then these financial corporations, especially if you're late on your credit card, are charging us upwards to 30%. I don't know what that is. It's not capitalism. It's extortion. And that's the system that we live under. So because there are no self-imposed limits, there will be a response. It may not look like Occupy. It may not call itself Occupy. Indeed, I don't think that it will. But I've covered movements all over the world. I covered the revolutions in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. I covered both of the Palestinian uprisings or intifadas. I covered the street demonstrations that brought down Milosevic. And you know as a reporter that the tinder is there. So having spent 2 years writing Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt out of the very poorest pockets of the country with Joe Sacco, and having been, in cities like Camden, which per capita is the poorest city in the United States and not surprisingly the most dangerous, something's coming. What will trigger it? It will be benign. It will be a seemingly innocuous event.
In Brazil, it was bus fares.
There you go. In the first Palestinian uprising, it was a traffic accident. But something's coming. Now, I should add that in American society, we have a long tradition of extremist, vigilante, right-wing violence, which can be categorized as fascist, where you fuse the language and iconography of the state with the Christian religion, where you demonize the vulnerable, Muslims, undocumented workers, homosexuals, intellectuals, liberals, feminists. They have a long list of people they hate. And those are powerful forces within American society. The left has been destroyed, especially the radical left, quite consciously in the whole name of anti-communism, and The Death of the Liberal Class really explains the destruction of those movements. But those movements were important because, as Howard Zinn points out, in The People's History of the United States, they opened up the democratic space. That the people who founded this country were slave-holding white male oligarchs who were terrified, and you can see it in the Federalist Papers, of any kind of popular democracy. And so that all of the advances within American society and within the industrialized world, we had the bloodiest, deadliest labor wars of any country. Hundreds of workers were killed, thousands were wounded. The violence was quite brutal and quite extreme. And so you saw with the abolitionists, with the labor movement, with the suffragists, even with the civil rights movement, movements outside the power structure, condemned as radical, that forced a liberal elite to respond and open up space. Now the radical movements are gone and destroyed, and more importantly, the liberal institutions have been disemboweled to serve corporate interests. So what the result is that we as citizens have, through the traditional structures of power, been left powerless to respond. The only hope left is to get out in the street and build the kind of mass movements that I saw in countries like East Germany, where you had 500,000 people showing up in Alexanderplatz in East Berlin, or 500,000 people showing up in the streets of Prague and in Wenceslas Square during the Velvet Revolution, which I also covered. I'm not naive enough to tell you it's going to work. But appealing to the better nature of the Democratic Party, I can assure you is not going to work.
But doesn't this mass movement need some kind of electoral strategy? Otherwise, you wind up in a situation, don't you, like what happened in Egypt, where Mubarak falls, but there is no electoral strategy of the left in any place, so it's the Muslim Brotherhood that winds up...
I've covered totalitarian states all over the world, and they all have elections.
No, I didn't say... I said, doesn't it need an electoral strategy?
I'm not sure that it does. I think that the problem is, you know, and Karl Popper writes this in The Open Society and Its Enemies. He said, the question is not how do you get good people to rule. Popper says that's the wrong question. Most people, Popper writes, attracted to power are at best mediocre, which is Obama, or venal, which is Bush. The question is, how do you make the power elite frightened of you? Who was the last liberal president we had? It was Richard Nixon. Not because he was a liberal, but because he was frightened of movements. And there's a scene, I think it's in Kissinger's memoirs, 1971, huge anti-war demonstration surrounding the White House. And Nixon has put empty buses, city buses, end to end as a kind of barricade. And he's standing at the window, wringing his hands, going, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us. And that's just where you want power, people in power to be. And that's why Sarkozy, who was a cretin, was unable to do too much damage to France. Because if you got up in France and told French university students that they were going to pay $50,000 a year to go to college, they shut the damn country down. And we have to recognize that for those of us who care about defending the rights of the underclass, we have to hold fast to the moral imperatives of movements and force power to respond to those movements. If we integrate those movements into the power structure, if we, in essence, compromise the integrity of those movements, we diminish their power. And that goes back to Julian Benda, his great work, The Treason of Intellectuals, where he says all of us have the option of serving two sets of principles, privilege and power or justice and truth. But for those of us who care about privilege and power, the more we make concessions to those who serve privilege and power, for those of us who care about justice and truth, the more we diminish the capacity for justice and truth. The point is to build organizations that make the power elite frightened of us. And if we invest our energy, as I think the left unfortunately has, into political parties, or at least let's say the Democratic Party, and I wrote Nader's major policy speeches for him in 2008 and voted for Gene Stein in the last election, but as a kind of protest vote. Then all of the programs that I think we so desperately need in a democratic state are going to be destroyed. I mean, Roosevelt was a compromise figure. You had the Communist Party, you had the Progressive Party, you had anarcho-syndicalist unions like the Wobblies, you had a radical left that was putting pressure. So Roosevelt says that his greatest achievement is that he saved capitalism, and he's right. And most of the policies that he adopted, he took from the left.
But to go back to what you wrote, the inability to articulate a viable socialism has been our gravest mistake. In the 30s, there was a movement, for better or worse, that had a vision of something to fight for. It wasn't just to fight against. It wasn't just a holding
That's
operation.
what I'm saying. But I'm saying that we have to hold, you have to hold fast to that moral imperative. So if you keep conceding, I mean, let's look at what the liberal class has conceded to the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party in Europe would be a far-right party. It's pro-war, it's anti-union, it's anti-civil liberties. I mean, Obama's assault on civil liberties is worse than Bush. It's an enemy of the press. It's used the Espionage Act to shut down whistleblowers, which are the lifeblood of a free press. It has assassinated American citizens. I mean, you know, at what point do you say enough? And I think that Nader was correct when he ran for president by saying if we can get 5, 10, 15 million people to withdraw from the system as a kind of counterweight, we can begin to put pressure from the other side. But right now there is no pressure from the other side because we are effectively manipulated. Look, both sides of the political spectrum are manipulated by the same forces. If you're some right-wing Christian zealot in Georgia. Then it's homosexuals and abortion and all these, wedge issues that are used to whip you up emotionally. If you are a liberal in Manhattan, it's, they'll all be teaching creationism in your schools or whatever. Yet, in fact, it's just a game. Because whether it's Bush or whether it's Obama, Goldman Sachs wins, always. There is no way to vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs. And it's only by stepping outside the system and challenging the system, and we can do that through electoral politics, which is what Debs did, 1912. I think he polled 6% of the vote. But that doesn't mean that we'll take power. It just means that we will begin to build forces that will pressure power to respond. And I think that's what we've forgotten. We have to begin to make the power elite terrified of us. And Occupy did that, by the way. They were terrified of Occupy. And you saw in the election...
Because they thought it would really catch on.
Well,
bigger than it was.
And they had to destroy it. And let's remember who destroyed it. Barack Obama destroyed it in a coordinated federal campaign, because the people who were most threatened by Occupy were the Democrats, which is why they tried to co-opt the language and they sent out Van Jones, Occupy the ballot booth and all this kind of stuff. In the same way they were threatened by Nader, 2000. They were terrified of Nader, which is Nader's mortal enemy became the Democratic Party, challenging all his voter lists, which of course made him spend millions in legal fees to fight back, demonizing him for the election of Bush, when in fact Bush was appointed by fiat by the Supreme Court. It had nothing to do with Nader. They didn't do the recount in Florida because Gore had won. So what I'm saying is that you can have an electoral strategy, but an electoral strategy is not going to include embracing the Democratic Party.
Well, let's pick that up in the next segment. Yeah, I'm not yet saying what I think the strategy is. I'm just saying if there isn't one, in some way or form, then you're never talking about taking power. At best, you're talking about a defensive operation and putting pressure on those who have power. But hold on.
Okay, all right.
We're going to do this in the next segment.
Okay.
So please join us, the next part of this series of interview with Chris Hedges on Reality Asserts Itself on the Real News Network.
My name is Mitchell Krogman, and I just want to say you talk about raising the minimum wage to $15, right?
Yes.
Say, what would you say to the people who say that it can't be done or shouldn't be done?
Good.
What would you say to them?
This is what I would say, and thank you very much, Mitchell, for the question. Implicit in everything that I have said is a little bit of an understanding of history of how things happen, okay? If I was standing here with you 40 years ago, and I said, I think that the United States will become mature enough racially that in the year 2008, an African American will be elected president of the United States. If I said that 40 years ago, people in this room would have said, you are nuts. See, you're young, and you don't know that. You take it for granted. Now, I'm not here whether you like Obama, you don't like Obama, that's not the point. And by the way, Iowa played a huge role in that. But that happened because millions of people for decades, it wasn't just Martin Luther King Jr., millions of people said, we are going to end racism and segregation. And obviously, we still have a long way to go. When we talk about women's rights and women's struggles, when I was mayor of Burlington, this is back in the mid-1980s, we appointed, you ready for this? Pretty radical, a woman police officer. Whoa! How wild and crazy can you be? And you're laughing. And it's good that you're laughing, because now it's a non-issue. It wasn't a non-issue in the 1980s. That people with disabilities are now mainstreamed into public schools, you take for granted, didn't happen by accident. If we were sitting here 10 years ago, not 40 years ago, And somebody said, well, you know, I think gay marriage will be legal in every state in the country, and the overwhelming majority of young people will be supportive. Somebody here would have told me, you're crazy. That's what's happened. Why do I say all of those things? Because that is how change occurs, Mitchell. Change occurs from the bottom on up. Give you 5 years ago, if I stood before you and I said, I believe in a $15 an hour minimum wage, you would have said, whoa, pretty crazy stuff, Bernie. Well, you know what happened? Because people in the fast food industry and elsewhere went out on strike. And I met with those people, and I've marched with those people. And they said, you know what, we can't make it on $7.25 or $8 or $9 an hour. And the American people said, yeah, we understand that. And what happened is Seattle and Los Angeles and San Francisco and other communities began to raise the minimum wage up to $15 an hour over the next few years. That's how change comes. So I have not the slightest doubt that when millions of people stand up and say loudly and clearly that a minimum wage has got to be a living wage, yes, we will achieve that goal.
Hello, Senator Sanders. My name is Noah Tang, and I'm a future educator. I taught, student taught in Chicago public schools last summer, and many of the 8th graders I taught English to were reading and learning at a 3rd grade level. What are you going to do to help the underprivileged and just disadvantaged students and schools achieve their dreams of going to college?
Well, Noah, first of all, thank you very much for going into education. And when we talk about the political revolution, one of the things we are talking about is changing our national priorities. And I'm a big football, I know in Iowa football is a big deal, got it? We in New England also watch the Patriots occasionally, okay? But you know what? Tom Brady is a great American hero. You are more of an American hero than Tom Brady is. And I want us as a nation, to understand that education and enhancing our educational system and our intellects, that is a lifelong pursuit. And that starts with having a first-class child care and pre-K system. It starts by making sure we adequately fund public education and we attract the best teachers that we can. And it includes making public colleges and universities tuition-free. I want to see a cultural revolution so that kids in Chicago and in Burlington, Vermont, understand that it is cool, really cool to be reading and thinking and talking about ideas. So to answer your question, Noah, maybe instead of giving tax breaks to billionaires, we adequately fund education from child care through higher education. Okay, where's the mic? Wait a minute. We got a mic over there somewhere? Yeah.
It's an honor to be here, hearing you speak. I drove here 6 hours.
Whoa.
From Springfield,
Thank you.
Illinois.
Thank you.
And if you remember at the Democratic debate, I was the guy, as you were getting in the car, and I reach in and I say, here's a yarmulke that says Bernie Sanders in Hebrew and English. The reason I came up here is something that happened just 2 days ago. And I want to talk about the ethics. I want to talk about the ethics of the press, and in particular of Associated Press. And I want to out them here and now. I was in a Hillary Clinton town hall in Urbandale, Iowa, and I talked about the Weed Out Hate initiative, an idea that gets righteous people of this country to teach and instruct people to relate weeding the garden with rooting out hatred.
Yes.
And by the time the Associated Press got done with that article, Weed Out Hate became her idea in response to what do Americans do in response to fear, and the right-wing press played ping pong with the left-wing press, and it was just an unbelievable thing.
Welcome to my world. All right.
But this is
All right. Let me just deal with, because you're raising an important question that has to be raised, and something that I am very concerned about. I had hoped, truly, that in this country, which has suffered, and we are certainly not unique in this, it exists all over the world, the stain of racism for so many, many years, that what I see right now, and I'm seeing it with the attacks against Latinos and the undocumented in this country, I am seeing it in the last few days against the Muslim community in this country. What I am seeing is Trump and other demagogues attempting to divide this country, to force or try to get the American people to hate somebody because of their religion or because of their country of birth. That is disgusting, that is unacceptable, and as a nation, we must reject it.
Go ahead, 30 seconds.
But this is the way that people have often won elections. Now, Donald Trump thinks that low wages in this country are just fine. I believe he says having a low minimum wage is not a bad thing for this country. Donald Trump believes that our wages are too high. Donald Trump believes that we should give huge tax breaks to billionaires. So while they get us to try to hate Muslims or Latinos, giving huge tax breaks to billionaires and not raising the minimum wage. Our job is to be smarter than that. Our job is to stand together and say, no, we're not going to fall for it. We're not going to hate Muslims. We're not going to hate Latinos. We're going to stand together as one people and create a country that works for all of us. Okay, Phil, you got a question? Okay, yeah.
Senator Sanders, what's your personal take on public banks? As you know, North Dakota has the only public bank in the United States, and there's some students, one I know of, who has a 3% interest rate on their student loans and everything, and plus public banks can also help build up our infrastructure and education, our roads and bridges. What's your take on that?
I think it's a great idea. I think it's a great idea, and I think states like Vermont can look to North Dakota, which has had that bank since the 1920s, I believe. Is that right? Started by the populist movement way back when. And it's what they do there is public money, tax money and so forth, that goes into the bank, and then they reinvest that money to make their economy stronger and to protect the interests of their own people. I think it is a very smart idea, and I support the idea. Okay, a couple of more questions. Where's the mic? Okay, good.
My name is Joyce Lewis. I love you forever. And I want to know, are you going to help Amtrak by chance?
Absolutely. Look. When we talk about climate change and when we talk about energy efficiency, it's not only making our buildings more energy efficient, it's also taking a very hard look at the transportation system, which uses huge amounts of energy. Our rail system today, both in terms of passenger rail and cargo, is way behind Europe, Japan, and even China in some instances. So yes, we have got to invest in our rail system, move cargo much more energy efficiently than is currently the case, and move passengers as well. Yeah, I believe very much in Amtrak. You're welcome. All right, maybe last question. All right. All right. Yes.
teachers is making your decision hundreds and thousands of miles away. How is that going to be any good? Your police?
What's your question?
My question is, U.S. already gives aid to countries like mine, Nigeria. Why don't put that, say, okay, we're going to give you aid, but we need to see these policies.
Yes, got it. Okay, I think the question is to make sure that U.S. foreign aid is used to help the people. Is that your question?
That's correct.
Okay. You know, there was a time, you know, we do spend a lot of money abroad. Too often what we're doing is propping up militaries, and we're selling a lot of military equipment. I would like to see us be the country known around the world where when kids get an education or when they get health care, they can thank the people of the United States for improving their lives. So I agree with what you said. All right, let me just again thank all of you for coming out today. Thank you for your help in this campaign, and welcome to the political revolution. Thank you.
I think that it's incumbent upon us to look closely at what's happening within the prison system in this country, because it's a microcosm of what our corporate masters are planning for the rest of us. Because that is a place at which there is no impediment for corporate abuse. That is like those sacrifice zones that Joe and I wrote about in Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, where once there's no impediment to corporate power, the environment is destroyed, families are destroyed. I mean, you go to southern West Virginia where they're blowing the tops 400 feet off the mountains, giant toxic impoundment ponds. We would go into elementary schools in the nurse's office, and there's rows of little inhalers because none of those kids can breathe. We went into Hollis in southern West Virginia where everybody had had their gallbladders removed from all of the toxins that come through the sludge that is pumped into their showers and their kitchens and everything else. That's what happened. And now we've all become a sacrifice zone. You watch, I wrote a column, which you should pull up, called The Prison State of America, but it's about all the corporations. It details all the ways they make money. So now when you go into prison, you don't get shoes. Remember, these people earn $1.30 a day for 8 hours of work. And they don't get shoes. So they're earning $28 a month. Shoes, a pair of Nikes in prison costs $45. Commissary prices, I got a list of, now it's in this article, commissary prices in 1996, I compared them with commissary prices today, they've gone up by 100%, but salaries have remained the same. So you have charge after charge. If you have a member of your immediate family who is either dying or dead, you can get a 15-minute visit them either in the hospital or at the viewing, and they charge you $800. Actually, it can be over $900 for the guards. So you slap these fees on these people, and they have no income. So now we're watching people, if they ever get out of the prison system, they're in debt to thousands of dollars. And they can't get work, they're locked out of housing, they can't get food stamps, and if they can't meet their debt obligation that they incurred working 8 hours a day in prison, they're back in prison. Go on Corrections Corp of America's website. There's the largest for-profit prison in the country. And they say on there, we're a really good business because America has a 64% recidivism rate, i.e., don't worry, most of those who get out are going right back in. And that's where we're headed, which I will end, brings me to my last book, Wages of Rebellion. And it asks the question is, how in a species of totalitarianism, the corporate totalitarianism, the inverted totalitarianism that we live under. How do you revolt? And I spend a lot of time talking to people who have revolted. Julian Assange, who I saw in the embassy in Ecuador several times, Mumia Abu-Jamal, Jeremy Hammond, and others. Because I want people to understand when you seriously revolt what the state does to you. And I think it has to begin to be the understanding that revolt itself is a moral imperative. That asking the question as to whether it can succeed is the wrong question. Revolt is not finally about what we achieve, but revolt is about what we become. I don't fight fascists because finally I believe that I will win. I fight fascists because they are fascists. And these fascists have us by the throat, and they have my children by the throat. And if nothing else, especially those of us who come from the older generation, we are allowing these forces to rob our young of their future. So that even if we fail, and I speak as a father, I want my children to be able to say he tried. So the question is not, finally, whether we can succeed. I don't like going to jail. Going to jail is more time than I care to donate to the US government. But I think that in those acts of defiance, in the rebuilding of mass radical movements that have been consciously destroyed, in the understanding that it's not our job to achieve power. That's the wrong question. You know, Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies says precisely that. Most people, he says, attracted to power are at best mediocre, which is Obama, or venal, which is Bush. The question, Popper says, is not how do you get good people to rule, but how do you make those in power frightened of you? So there's a scene in Kissinger's memoirs, don't buy the book, where Kissinger and Nixon, I think it's 71, are sitting in the White House. There's a huge anti-war demonstration, and Nixon has taken empty city buses end to end in a kind of wagon train all around the White House. And Nixon's wringing his hands going, "Henry, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us." And that's precisely where we want people in power to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris Hedges. Folks, we have an opportunity here for a little bit of a question and answer period. I've got a microphone that I can kind of bring your direction. I would ask that you make your question succinct, not a long diatribe, but a specific question. And we can probably take them for 10 or 15 minutes here. So, all right, over this way. If it makes it faster, you can come down too.
Mr. Hedges, thank you so much for coming to Little Olympia, Thurston County. But my question is, you mentioned at the beginning you were going to say something about Occupy. Will you talk about Occupy, please?
The Occupy movement was an extremely important moment in this process of rebellion, because it was primarily driven by what Bakunin called déclassé intellectuals, i.e. the children, sons and daughters of the middle class, who were often college educated, had tremendous loans, and walked out into the wider society and found that there was no place for them. And that group of that was, by the way, the big battle between Marx and Bakunin. Marx dismissed the importance of déclassé intellectuals, and Bakunin said they were absolutely vital to any successful revolt. And I think Bakunin was right. It experienced for the first time what people in marginal communities, especially people of color, have been experiencing for decades: unemployment, police abuse, eviction, hopelessness. And I think that that is emblematic of the failure on the part of the traditional liberal elite. I think that the kind of boutique activism of the liberal class, which got too involved in gender politics and identity politics and multiculturalism, all of which I support, but forgot about the fundamental issue of justice. So while the working class was being destroyed, they busied themselves on inclusiveness, which is, of course, is important, but not at the expense of justice. And so there was a kind of skepticism of the Occupy movement by many in marginal communities, because they said, well, where were you? And that's a fair question. Now, the Occupy movement was a mainstream movement in the sense that I believe it articulated the demands of the mainstream. And the Occupy movement is a perfect example of how the corporate state is not rational. So a rational response to the Occupy movement would have been a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, a massive jobs program, especially targeted people under the age of 25, a rational healthcare system instead of this corporate monstrosity that's being shoved down our throat, i.e. the public option for everyone. And the state responded by physically eradicating the occupying encampments, which was very short-sighted. And remember, it was all coordinated by the Obama White House. Because this was a nonviolent movement. Some of you may know my entanglements with the Black Bloc, but this was a mainstream nonviolent movement. And I believe that what terrified the state, I mean, especially if you were in Zuccotti on the weekends, you had all these parents with strollers pushing their kids from New Jersey, you know, that terrified the state. And you saw the classic attempt on figures like Van Jones, part of the Democratic establishment, to co-opt the Occupy movement and funnel the energy back into a dead political system. But finally, I think we have to look at the Occupy movement as a tactic, in the same way that the freedom rides in the old civil rights movement were a tactic. So the freedom rides, someone correct me if I'm wrong, at 54, 55, you have the sit down at the lunch counters around 61. Something's coming. I mean, I covered most of the revolutions in Eastern Europe. I covered East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania. And nobody can predict. I know the tinder's there, but nobody can predict what will ignite it. So on November 9th, 1989, I was in Leipzig with the leaders of the East German opposition. And I remember them saying to me, this was in the afternoon, maybe within a year there will be free passage back and forth across the Berlin Wall. By that evening, the Berlin Wall, at least as an impediment to human traffic, did not exist. Even the leaders themselves didn't know. Once these movements take off, they have a kind of centrifugal force. And I think we have to look at Greece, because throughout history, revolutionary movements come in waves. If, after this 4-month agreement, the Greeks walk away from the euro, and it's not ultimately sustainable, 175% debt for Greece is 75% of GDP. It's not sustainable. If they walk away and survive, and of course the international banking community will do just what they did to Allende, there will be bread lines and gas shortages and power outages. They will use every mechanism in their power to destroy an independent Greece. But if it survives, you have Podemos, which is running for elections in Spain in December, and you have powerful movements in Ireland in Italy, in Portugal, and at that point the system could break down. So when all of this happens, it happens at such a pace by which even the leaders of the movement it takes on a kind of life of its own. And I think the Occupy is emblematic of this cauldron of dissent. So what comes next may not be called Occupy, it may not look like Occupy, and I think Black Lives Matter is part of this, it is kind of hereditary to this movement, but that something is coming, I have no doubt.
Thank you. Mr. Hedges, thank you for demonstrating what I believe is true patriotism. We have an organization in our state called WA-MEND, W-A, the abbreviation for Washington, MEND. And they mirror what's going on in many states around the country. Effort to overturn the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United and other decisions, which essentially created out of whole cloth, out of thin air, the concept of corporate personhood, which allows corporations basically to buy elections in more than one way, campaign donations and others. I've heard it said amongst those people, 17 states, by the way, have approved either an initiative or a law demanding that Congress proffer an amendment that says a corporation is not a person, money is not free speech. I've heard people say that when it gets to 37, 38, 39, 40 states, if we can do that, and Congress refuses to act, that this will really set the American people on fire politically. Could you comment on the movement around the country to overturn Citizens United?
I think that posits that the system's redeemable. And I think, boy, just watch the U.S. Congress on their knees, well, on their feet before Bibi Netanyahu, or all 100 senators passing a resolution while Israel is carrying out absolutely egregious war crimes using attack aircraft to bomb a civilian population that has no army, no navy, no air force, no command and control center, no mechanized units, and calling it Israeli self-defense. I mean, money has replaced the vote, and those who now are sitting both in state and national legislatures are corporate employees, and they are not going to turn on their patrons. I think, and this is what I spent all morning talking to Kshama about, and what we've been discussing. I think we have to begin to create a movement or a party like Syriza in Greece. Remember, Syriza 10 years ago only polled 4%. Syriza now has an approval rating in Greece of 70%. Podemos could very well win the election in Spain. And I think that we have to create our own entity. And as Kshama was saying this morning, the ironclad rule is that we will not take 1 cent of corporate money, not a penny. That is absolutely a non-negotiable demand. And I think that we have to recreate the movements that created democracy in America with the understanding that it's not our job to take power, it's our job to scare the shit out of people in power. That's our job. And we can do that if we hold fast to those moral imperatives. You could argue that in 1968, the most powerful political figure in this country was Martin Luther King. Because when he went to Selma or Memphis, 50,000 people went with him. That's what we have to recreate. We have to, I do in that sense buy the anarchist notion that power is the problem. I don't agree with John Holloway and other anarchists that you can exercise power by not taking power. And it's those mass movements that keep power, even sympathetic power, in check. And we have to rebuild those movements. So this is what we were discussing this morning, because we want to be ready. You don't, if things begin to crumble, they're getting ready, and we want to be ready. And if things go down and there is unrest, and they're certainly preparing for it, I think one of the reasons they passed the National Defense Authorization Act is because they finally don't trust the police to protect them. And there's some indication, if you remember the Chicago teachers' strike, when they were, every time they go in precincts to use the bathroom or something, they'd be applauded by the Chicago police. Or when we did an action with Veterans for Peace in front of the White House, 133 of us got arrested on the White House fence when we were being cuffed. It turns out that most of the DC police are in the National Guard and had been in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they were cuffing us saying, keep protesting these wars, because they stink. Now, the ruling class has to understand that this sentiment is running through the foot soldiers who maintain control. But we have to have a political vision, which in my case has to be socialist, a political vision, and a party that remains outside of the control of corporate power, along with those mass movements in order to be effective. But we are entering a moment of crisis when we've been utterly disarmed. And those forces, retrograde forces on the right, are very powerful, because vigilante violence and American fascism is very real. I mean, as the Klan is, Ku Klux Klan, which controlled whole states, including Indiana, is kind of the pure expression of American fascism. And you see it with the Tea Party and the lunatic fringe of the Republican Party. I mean, I do have to hand it to Clinton in this, in that basically Clinton made the Democratic Party into the Republican Party, and he pushed the Republican Party so far to the right they became insane. Okay, so there was a kind of logic to it. We have to create mechanisms to defend ourselves, because you have the Koch brothers and under the Tea Parties, the militias, and these are proto-fascist movements. Proto-fascist or fascist movements channel a very legitimate rage. The rage is legitimate. But instead of directing it towards the centers of power, it directs it at the vulnerable. Undocumented workers, Muslims, homosexuals, feminists, intellectuals. You know, they have a long list of people they hate. And that is a strong undercurrent in the American culture. I mean, we are a very, very violent culture. And it may, if we're not prepared, that backlash, and there will be a backlash, could be a right-wing backlash that calls for a more overtly authoritarian structure. But I don't think that, you know, I know Lawrence Lessig has raised $12 million to do super PACs, which failed miserably. You know, as if on the level of money, we can't compete. And it doesn't matter what we want. Obama in 2008, you know, he made dozens of promises, including revisiting NAFTA and closing Guantanamo and not doing torture and wholesale service. I mean, none of which he kept. Because you don't get power in this country unless you serve the interests of the Imperium, Wall Street, and the internal security and surveillance apparatus. Otherwise, you don't have power.
Hi. I'm a school teacher, and I wanted to let everyone know, and Mr. Hedges, you may already know this, but the corporations are gunning for our public schools right now, and they're doing it through the guise of this high-stakes testing.
Right.
The corporations, namely the Gates Foundation, the Walmart Foundation, Pearson Publishing, and who else is in there? Oh, all the banks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, they're trying to close down our public schools. And the way that they do it is they create these tests that 60 to 70% of kids are destined to fail. So they create it using the hardest questions. This is going to be our way to change this system, because they're going after our children right now.
Well, that's, yeah, that's right. And charter schools.
And so what they do is, in Rahm Emanuel closed down 100
Right.
public schools, and they turn them into charter for-profit schools, and the banks are behind the schools. So I was wondering if you could speak to this, and if I could plug my website. It's called weaponsofmassdeception.org. I'm one of these really wild, riled up types of people. I might not look like it. But we are having hundreds and thousands of parents in the Puget Sound area waking up. We have schools refusing to give the test. Students are walking out of the test in Colorado, New Mexico, Seattle. We are not going to be putting up with this, because the kids know the corporations have no right to call me a failure and to call me not ready for college and career based on a stupid test. Pearson makes $2.1 billion a year. I hope all of you can look into this. My website, again, is weaponsofmassdeception.org. We must stand united against the corporate takeover of our public schools.
Well, that's right. And I mean, anytime hedge fund managers become intensely interested in the plight of inner city schools, it's not because they want to teach people to read. It's because they know the U.S. government spends about $600 billion in education, and they want it. And what they're doing is creating a system of education that's purely vocational, because, as you know, as a teacher, teaching people how to think and teaching people what to think are very different enterprises. And what they want is a rote kind of learning. Because, let's face it, the liberal arts, by their nature, let's go back to Plato, are subversive. You are taught, if you are trained in liberal arts, to question assumptions and structures and power, to ask questions that are uncomfortable to those who hold power. And that's why there has been such a fierce war against the liberal arts and the turning of even major research universities into highly specialized vocational schools. And I speak of my own school, Harvard, which is quickly trying to emulate Stanford, so that you have a situation where the humanities are pushed to the margins. And then once you get to state schools, you have whole departments that must raise all their own money, not only for their research money, but often for their salaries. Well, if you're teaching classics, who's going to fund you? If you're teaching philosophy, you know, all of those disciplines that deal with the possibility of transformation. Because the goal is to create systems managers, people who don't question the system, but seek only to serve it. And that's what schools like, now I've taught at Princeton, people like at schools like Princeton and Harvard do. They turn out systems managers. Harvard was, a couple years ago, 49% of its graduating class was going into financial services, but that didn't count all the people who went to law school and became corporate lawyers. What about our teachers? What about our doctors? What about, you know, all of these professions that make a civil society possible? And the elite institutions, I mean, one of the things that kind of cracks me up about Obama, you know, he's here, you know, we have to be more educated to compete on the world level. No, no, no. The people who got us into this mess were the best educated. Larry Summers, and they all went to all of these elite schools. The problem isn't education. The problem is greed. And I'm with you, and I'm terrified. I mean, my son just finished a graduate degree in French literature at Columbia, but when he went to college, I said, if you take anything anybody tells you as practical, you've just wasted my money. The point is to learn how to think. Because if you don't learn how to think, you're a drone, which is just what they're trying to create. And it's drones on various levels. So if you're an inner city school, they'll give you enough literacy to stand behind the counter at a Burger King. And if you're at Princeton, you're still a drone. They're just giving you the technical skills to go to Goldman Sachs and, you know, let's not even get started on Goldman Sachs. I was arrested in front of Goldman Sachs. But Cornel West and I held a people's hearings of Goldman Sachs in Zuccotti Park. And we brought single mothers who'd been evicted from their homes and school teachers who had lost their jobs. And then it's kind of funny. I gave up a long time ago trying to look hip. So there's actually a picture of about 300 protesters. All of us are walking towards Goldman Sachs, and we block the entrance of Goldman Sachs. And everybody around me is like pierced and tattooed and mohawked. And I have a button-down Brooks Brothers shirt and a little tweed jacket. But we blocked the entrance of Goldman Sachs. Anybody have a copy of Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt? Do you? Can you have it with you? Oh, okay, I was gonna. Oh, I'm just gonna read this little section to you since you brought it up. So this is Goldman Sachs, one of the most evil corporations in human history. And I'll close with this. faces appeared to me. Moments before protesters from Occupy Wall Street and I were arrested on a windy November afternoon in front of Goldman Sachs. They were not the faces of the smug Goldman Sachs employees who peered at us through the revolving glass doors and lobby windows. They were not the faces of the blue uniform police with their dangling plastic handcuffs, or the thuggish Goldman Sachs security personnel whose buzz cuts and dead eyes reminded me of the Stasi. They were not the faces of the demonstrators around me, the ones with massive student debts and no jobs, the ones weighed down by their broken dreams, the ones whose anger and betrayal triggered the street demonstrations and occupations for justice. They were not the faces of the onlookers, the construction workers who seemed cheered by the march on Goldman Sachs, or the suited businessmen who did not. They were faraway faces. They were the faces of children dying. They were tiny, confused, bewildered faces I had seen in the southern Sudan, Gaza, the slums of Brazzaville, Nairobi, Cairo, Delhi, and the wars I covered. They were faces with large, glassy eyes above bloated bellies. They were the small faces of children, convulsed by the ravages of starvation and disease. I carry these faces. They do not leave me. I look at my own children and cannot forget them, these other children who never had a chance. War brings with it a host of horrors, but the worst is always the human detritus that war and famine leave behind. The small, frail bodies whose tangled limbs and vacant eyes condemn us all. The wealthy and the powerful, the ones behind the glass at Goldman Sachs, laughed and snapped pictures of us as if we were an odd lunchtime diversion from commodities trading, from hoarding and profit, from the collective sickness of money worship, as if we were creatures in a cage, which in fact we soon were. Goldman Sachs Commodities Index is the most heavily traded in the world. The financial firm hoards futures of rice, wheat, corn, sugar, and livestock, and jacks up commodity prices by as much as 200% on the global market, so that poor families can no longer afford basic staples and literally starve. Hundreds of millions of poor in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America do not have enough to eat in order to feed this mania for profit. The technical jargon learned in business schools and on trading floors effectively masks the reality of what is happening: murder. The cold, neutral words of business and commerce are designed to make systems operate, even systems of death, with a ruthless efficiency. The people behind the windows and those of us with arms locked in a circle on the concrete outside did not speak the same language. Profit, trade, speculation, globalization, war, national security. These are the words they use to justify the snuffing out of tiny lives, acts of radical evil. The glass tower before us is filled with people carefully selected for the polish and self-assurance that comes with having been formed in institutions of privilege. Their primary attributes are a lack of consciousness, a penchant for deception, aggressiveness, a worship of money, and an incapacity for empathy or remorse. And it is always the respectable classes, the polished Ivy League graduates, the prep school boys and girls who grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, or Short Hills, New Jersey, who are the most susceptible to evil. To be intelligent, as many are, at least in a narrow analytical way, is morally neutral. These respectable citizens are inculcated in their elitist ghettos with values and norms, including pious acts of charity used to justify their privilege, and a belief in the innate goodness of American power. They are trained to pay deference to systems of authority. They are taught to believe in their own goodness, unable to see or comprehend, and are perhaps indifferent to the cruelty inflicted on others by the exclusive systems they serve. And as norms change, as the world is steadily transformed by corporate forces into a small cobble of predators and a vast herd of human prey, these elites seamlessly replace one set of values with another. These elites obey the rules, they make the system work, and they are rewarded for this. In return, they do not question. We seem to have lost, at least until the advent of the Occupy Wall Street movement, not only all personal responsibility, but all capacity for personal judgment. Corporate culture absolves all of responsibility. This is part of its appeal. It relieves all from moral choice. There is an unequivocal acceptance of principles such as unregulated capitalism and globalization as a kind of natural law. The steady march of corporate capitalism requires a passive acceptance of new laws and demolished regulations, of bailouts in the trillions of dollars, and the systematic looting of public funds, of lies and deceit. The corporate culture epitomized by Goldman Sachs has seeped into our classrooms, our newsrooms, our entertainment systems, and our consciousness. This corporate culture has stripped us of the right to express ourselves outside of the narrow confines of the established political order. We are forced to surrender our voice. Corporate culture serves a faceless system. It is, as Hannah Arendt wrote, the rule of nobody. And for this very reason, perhaps the least human and most cruel form of rulership. Those who resist, the doubters, outcasts, artists, renegades, skeptics, and rebels, rarely come from the elite. They ask different questions. They seek something else, a life of meaning. They have grasped Immanuel Kant's dictum, if justice perishes, human life on earth has lost its meaning. And in their search, they come to the conclusion that, as Socrates said, it is better to suffer wrong than do wrong. This conclusion makes a leap into the moral. It refuses to place a monetary value on human life. It acknowledges human life, indeed all life, as sacred. And this is why, as Arendt points out, the only morally reliable people are not those who say, this is wrong, or this should not be done, but those who say, I can't. The greatest evildoers are those who don't remember because they have never given thought to the matter. And without remembrance, nothing can hold them back, Arendt wrote. For human beings, thinking of past matters means moving in the dimension of depth, striking roots and thus stabilizing ourselves so as not to be swept away by whatever may occur, the zeitgeist or history or simple temptation. The greatest evil is not radical, it has no roots, and because it has no roots, it has no limitations, it can go to unthinkable extremes and sweep over the whole world. There are streaks in my lungs, traces of the tuberculosis I picked up around hundreds of dying Sudanese during the famine I covered as a foreign correspondent. I was strong and privileged and fought off the disease. They were not and did not. The bodies, most of them children, were dumped into hastily dug mass graves. The scars I carry within me are the whispers of these dead. They are the faint marks of those who never had a chance to become men or women, to fall in love and have children of their own. I carried these scars to the doors of Goldman Sachs. I placed myself at the feet of these commodity traders to call for justice because the dead and those dying in slums and refugee camps across the planet could not make the journey. I see their faces. They haunt me in the day, and they come to me in the dark.